pleased to host this session today. My name is Kathy Salmon. I am currently an education consultant, supporting Alberta and international school districts with EAL, English as an Additional Language, programming, and other school supports. I'm a retired school principal. I work for the Calgary Board of Education as a teacher, EAL consultant, assistant principal, and principal for over 22 years. 2 times I was seconded to Alberta Education, where I had the opportunity to co-write the benchmarks, the 1.0 version and the 2.0 version, which we will be talking about today. We have 2 learning intentions for this session. 1, to be aware of the requirements for language proficiency assessment for students who are learning English as an additional language, and the second one is to become familiar with the Benchmarks 2.0 document. This session will cover an activating prior knowledge activity, introduce the Alberta Education Annual Assessment requirements, and provide an overview of Benchmarks 2.0. The Benchmarks 2.0 can be found on Learn Alberta, on the Supporting English as an Additional Language Learners website. The URL is on the left. You can also do a quick Google search for Supporting English Language Learners Alberta, and the site should also come up. Please note that the document is a PDF and you can see it on the top right beside the picture. Part 1, Activating Prior Knowledge. Terminology has shifted over the years. ESL, English as a Second Language, was originally the acronym associated with this field. However, the word second is not necessarily accurate, as many learners know more than one language, and second can be kind of an othering term. ELL came into play as it was more inclusive, and those acquiring additional languages were called English language learners. However, English-only speakers are also English language learners, and the term failed to distinguish between monolingual English speakers and those that knew additional languages. So right now, the nom de jour, the current name, is English as an Additional Language, which is more additive and positive. It doesn't matter which of your languages English is. It means you have additional languages and you are learning English. The reason why English needs to be part of the title is for English medium schools where English is the medium of instruction, so the E is significant. But in reality, our learners are MLs. They're multilinguals and they speak many different languages, English being one of them. So the students are multilinguals and they may be enrolled in an English medium school, and therefore they are learning English as an additional language. Assessing English language proficiency may seem overwhelming or intimidating for some teachers who are not teachers of the English language subject. However, many people who speak English can easily identify simple English from more advanced and complex English. This little activity clearly shows how most speakers of English are able to sort these types of sentences from beginning, intermediate, and advanced proficiency. So you can pause the recording here, take a few moments, and sort these sentences from simple to more specific vocabulary. Here the list is sorted. Number 1, the easiest, the beginning, is the 2 words, she's nice. The contraction she is was not a trick. Many children will learn or acquire those contractions as one word, so she's nice is the simplest. Nice is the highest frequency word. It is used most often, which leads to number 2, he is kind and gentle. It is a simple sentence, and kind and gentle are more frequent words. Kind is 1 syllable, gentle has 2 syllables, and they are after nice in terms of frequency. So nice is the highest frequency word, then kind and gentle would come next, which is often when I'm doing this workshop live with teachers, when I ask them why did they sort number 2 before number 5, she's thoughtful and considerate, it is due to the frequency of the words. Kind and gentle are more frequently used than thoughtful and considerate. So typically teachers can do this intuitively. Additionally, thoughtful and considerate get into increased syllables, but also affixes as well. So they get to be more complex words and they're lower frequency. which leads to the fourth word, number one, or words number one. He is extremely compassionate and sympathetic. An adverb is added in here, and then again, compassionate and sympathetic are more specific, more precise, and they are used less frequently than thoughtful and considerate. So we've got high frequency words, nice, kind, and gentle, to lower frequency words, thoughtful, considerate, extremely compassionate and sympathetic. And our most advanced, her benevolent actions are admirable, is a less frequent word use, as well as the sentence structure is more complex. So most teachers are able to sort these from beginning to advanced without any issues, and that's all benchmarking is knowing the scope and sequence of the language development and being able to sort that. And for those teachers who are not teaching English as a subject, you know your subject, so trust in your subject knowledge and your ability to be able to distinguish beginner to advanced within your subject. Here is another example. This one is science specific. Again, we ask teachers to sort these three sentences, three statements that a student might say, into beginner, intermediate, and advanced proficiency. So stop the slide here and take a moment to level these beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Again, most teachers have no trouble sorting these sentences and identifying the beginner proficiency, intermediate, and advanced proficiency. The beginner is still on topic. They are still correct. They may have some grammatical errors and omissions, but that's okay. They are on topic and using the subject-specific vocabulary. The intermediate might use a simple sentence and high-frequency words, but they might also incorporate new words such as omnivore, which they've learned in the subject, into their simple sentences. Advanced students will add more subject-specific, more precise vocabulary and start experimenting with the complexity of their sentences, and the word order may change. So teachers are able to identify beginner, intermediate, and advanced. The purpose of doing these two sorting activities is to show teachers that they're capable of understanding the scope and sequence of English language, and that they can inherently recognize it as they have English themselves, whether it's their first, second, or additional language. We want the message to be that you don't need to be an EAL or ELL teacher in order to use the proficiency benchmarks and to be able to recognize students' language proficiency. And you don't need to have metalinguistic knowledge of English either to be able to recognize the beginner, intermediate, and advanced language. We want all teachers to recognize that in today's global world, they are most likely going to be teaching English as an additional language learners, so that they are all teachers of English as an additional language learners. And you can use the EAL proficiency benchmarks in any subject, whether it's phys ed, core, complementary, fine arts. You are able to use the benchmarks to assess language proficiency in your subject area. We want teachers to trust in their knowledge of their subjects and the language required to engage within that particular subject. Part 2, Alberta Education Annual Assessment Requirements. This is an image from the Alberta Education Funding Manual for the 2024-25 school year. EAL and francisation funding will continue to be allocated to school authorities based on assessments conducted by schools using the weighted moving average of EAL and francisation student counts. It states that a student assessed as needing additional language support requires an annual assessment of language proficiency development to inform instructional planning. And the funding is for up to 5 years. There is the source, it's from page 16 and 17, and you can click on the link or Google and find the funding manual for 2024 and 2025. The next 3 slides go over the criteria for eligibility for EAL funding as outlined in the funding manual. For students who are pre-K to grade 12 who require and receive EAL funding must be coded either 301, foreign-born, or 303, Canadian-born. They must have a language proficiency assessment on file that demonstrates the need for English language supports before applying for those codes. Additionally, there must be documentation of the assessment on file that demonstrates the need for English language supports. Funding is for a maximum of 5 years. For EAL students and children who are also included in the PUF funding grant or the Refugee Student Grant, they are not eligible to receive the EAL grant. They would only receive the EAL grant if they are no longer receiving the Refugee Grant or the PUF funding grant and are within the 5 years of funding. Students and children who are eligible for the Refugee Grant require additional supports and receive the 640 coding if they have the appropriate documentation of their refugee status on file. Page 53 goes on to explain and distinguish between the EAL grant and describe the criteria for using the Refugee Student Grant. The Refugee Student Grant has more funds allocated as additional resources are required when the student has significant gaps in their education due to war, trauma, or limited formal schooling experiences. So when EAL learners or families arrive and they qualify as a refugee, that would be determined as they are approved as refugees by the IRCC. And just like the EAL grant, the Refugee Student Grant will be allocated based on the weighted moving average FTE enrollment. The eligibility criteria for the Refugee Student Grant is similar to that of the EAL Student Grant, with one difference being the age is 4 years and 8 months for the Refugee Grant. Please note that students are not eligible for the Refugee Grant if they are enrolled in a home education program. And on page 54 of the funding manual, the criteria continues. Please note that, again, number 4 describes the 5 years and the not being able to combine the EAL and Refugee Grant, it's either one or the other. And point number 5, if the student is identified in accessing the Refugee Grant during the kindergarten year, it is at 0.5 of the grant allocation amount. The Guide to Education works in tandem with the funding manual. The Guide to Education stipulates that children and students who are learning English as an additional language, that they shall receive appropriate English language instruction and programming that meets the students' diverse learning needs and helps the students to develop English language proficiency. The Guide to Education also recognizes the significant additional supports that a child or student who qualifies for the Refugee Grant will need, including programming and supports. Additionally, the Guide to Education recognizes the Alberta K-12 English as an Additional Language Proficiency Benchmarks as a tool that can be used to document a student's initial English language proficiency as well as monitor and track their English language proficiency progress. If you have any questions regarding the funding manual or Guide to Education requirements, please contact Alberta Education Additional Languages. Part 3. The Overview of Benchmarks 2.0. The purpose of the benchmarks is to support teachers in monitoring and reporting progress, planning for explicit language instruction within everyday classroom learning, communicating with students and their parents to develop an understanding of language proficiency, to provide descriptions of language ability demonstrated at each proficiency level, to support the initial identification of language proficiency level, and guide effective instruction and program planning for English language learners. And these purposes meet the criteria listed in the funding manual and the Guide to Education. The benchmarks are designed for all educators to use. Any teachers of students that are learning English as an additional language, coordinators, consultants, and specialists, resource teachers, and school administrators can all use the benchmarks. Each school jurisdiction is responsible for determining at what points they will use the EAL benchmarks to assess English language proficiency. Typically, school districts will use the benchmarks to meet the annual coding requirements as outlined in the funding manual and to document programming and ongoing monitoring as outlined in the Guide to Education. This could be through documented EAL proficiency progress, through interim and semester report cards, and or via individual program plans for children and students. Again, the Supporting English as an Additional Language Learners website has a great deal of information and supports and tools for teachers to use to support their assessment of English language proficiency and understanding English as an additional language learners. There is a glossary to support teachers in understanding the criteria and indicators on the EAL benchmarks. There is additionally a PDF fillable tracking sheet to use to support teachers in documenting the progress and monitoring of EAL language proficiency for their students. There are videos and writing samples as well to support teachers in their annual assessment requirements. Benchmarks 2.0 contains 4 main sections. I will refer to the colors. The orange section is the 3 competencies that will be used for the annual assessment and monitoring. The green section is examples of those 3 competencies, which are vocabulary, sentence structure, and connector and transition words, and provides examples across listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So there are 12 pages of examples. The yellow section are the supporting competencies. Benchmarks 1.0 shared 28 different competencies, and these competencies were still valuable to be used as a resource. Therefore, the supporting competencies section features Benchmarks 1.0 as well as new additional competencies following the new outline of Benchmarks 2.0 and provides some support for teachers. The blue section is examples of vocabulary, sentence structure, and connector and transition words to be used as a resource to support teachers in completing the orange annual requirement to assess. This chart shows the comparison between Benchmarks 1.0 and Benchmarks 2.0 and the divisions and levels for assessment. Benchmark 1.0 had 5 different divisions: kindergarten, grade 1 to 3, 4 to 6, 7 to 9, and 10 to 12, and used a system of levels 1 to 5. Level 1 was synonymous with beginner, and level 5 is synonymous with advanced. For Benchmarks 2.0, there has been the addition of pre-K to kindergarten, and grade 1 was separated from grades 2 to 3. Additionally, early literacy levels have been included, noted as A and B, and there are 6 levels of proficiency development. Now, a beginner is associated with A, B, or 1 typically, and the number for the advanced then changes with the division. For example, in grades 2 to 3, an advanced would be at level 3 proficiency. Benchmarks 2.0 also contains a summary sheet. This one-pager can be used to introduce teachers to the benchmarks in a one-page format. It introduces the levels and then the listening, speaking, reading, and writing overview for each of those levels. Additionally, this page could be used to communicate with students and parents about the proficiency indicators or the levels that they're receiving on their report cards. It's a communication tool. This is one of the best parts about Benchmarks 2.0. It is one page. Vocabulary, sentence structure, connection, and transitions are the 3 competencies that teachers can assess. These 3 are the most overt and easy to recognize on the scope and sequence of proficiency development. You will note that each of the indicators starts with understands and uses. Therefore, the same indicators for understand, listening, and reading can be assessed in each of these 3 competencies. The uses is for speaking and writing. Therefore, this one row, 24 boxes, can be used to assess listening, speaking, reading, and writing English language proficiency in any subject area. Being on one page is more manageable for teachers to read, learn, and understand. This slide shows 3 different profiles of English as an additional language learner and how the benchmarks can be used to show higher proficiency in one strand over another. For example, in the middle on the left, there is a picture that shows oral language, listening, and speaking highlighted. This is a profile of a learner who has higher oral than their written capacities. Therefore, they might be a benchmark 3 in listening and speaking, and their written and understanding, the reading, or the written production, the writing, might be a level 2 or level 1, and the benchmarks can help identify that. Another profile is a student who has higher written understanding, so higher reading level and higher written production. This is typically the older arrival who has been educated in a different language as well as English, and they have not been exposed to as much oral English. So these later arrivals typically might be a level 4 in their reading and writing, and their oral language might be a level 3 or a level 2. Another profile of English language learner, which is a typical profile for many learners, is that their receptive language is higher than their productive language. So their listening might be a level 3 and their reading might be a level 3, while their productive, their speaking and writing might be a level 1 or 2. I know in the additional languages I speak, this is my profile, where I have a higher receptive understanding. I can listen and read and understand more than I'm able to produce. So the benchmarks help you to get to know your learners, and also not only gives you the level for each of listening, speaking, and writing, but it also shows you the pattern and where the student has their strengths. And we always want to use their strengths in their strands to help them grow their English language proficiency in the other strands. Many school districts have Benchmarks 2.0 and documentation requirements on a digital format. If school districts want to use a paper format, or teachers want to use a paper format as a working copy, this would be page 1 of our tracking sheet. And on the top left, there is a section where the initial information can be captured, and then below there are 5 years, based on the 5 years of funding, 5 slots to make notes and comment on the student's development over time, and of course the levels chart is on the top right. This is the back page of the tracking sheet, or page 2, and again, some school districts may document and track this information online. If you're using the paper version, you will notice that the orange sheet from before has slightly changed. There is a listening, speaking, reading, and writing in each column beside the competency indicator, and a blank. This blank is to hold the date. It is recommended that teachers use dates and not a highlighter, because highlighted information over time, even with a key or legend, are really messy to understand. And we also want to keep the original date that the child has obtained a particular skill. For example, if in vocabulary, in speaking, a student is level 2, and that S has a date of October 2023 in that speaking column, it is important that that date is maintained, because if we get to this October 2024 and the student has not moved, we have that original date of 2023. If that 2023 is erased and it's updated to 2024, and we get to the following year and the student is still there, we have not been aware that the student has now been there for 2 years. So it's really important that when you date your tracking sheet, the original date is maintained. You use the opposite side of the sheet to note that, yes, this information has been reviewed and updated on this date, but keep the tracking sheet for the date the child originally achieved a particular competency. And this sheet, working copy, can be passed on from teacher to teacher. If the tracking sheet gets a little messy, simply staple a new one on top and pass it along. And the history of the student and their proficiency progress is really critical, and it's a great way to maintain your understanding. For schools that are maintaining digital records, anecdotal information can be logged in your student information system as well. Benchmarks programming recommendations are a new part of Benchmarks 2.0. This wasn't in the original version of the benchmarks. What this shows is, based on the student's proficiency, there are certain programming recommendations. Of course, having a critical mass of students in any grade or in any subject helps with the programming, and there are strategies and solutions when there's not a critical mass or cohort of students at a particular proficiency level, because at different proficiency levels, naturally, different supports are required. The bright yellow shows that students with the lower proficiency may require some intensive supports and specific courses. Schools can do that in a variety of ways, through grouping and regrouping, through literacy blocks, lots of different ways of doing that. The green section talks about how they might need grade level curriculum adapted. Students are beginning to catch up and increase their proficiency, but may not have quite enough words yet to fully engage in the curriculum. Therefore, the curriculum might be adapted, and this adaptation would, of course, be accounted for on the report card. The purple shows differentiation. All students typically receive some sort of differentiation in our inclusive classrooms. These differentiated supports would include vocabulary supports, language structures, mentor texts, additional comprehension supports. These could be things that teachers are providing in class. So the green and the blue show how this can be existing in an inclusive classroom. For high school, it gets to be a little bit different as students are enrolled in courses. There are locally developed courses and an EAL program of studies and a recommendation of course progressions for high school students depending on what proficiency they're at. These are some of the areas I've been supporting schools internationally and in Alberta, and as well, Alberta Education has 2 consultants, including Sharon, who can provide some supports. Additionally, school districts can look at their other school district partners and leaders for supports with programming. As the number of EAL learners increases, as immigration is increasing, the programming is really critical to support these EAL learners in having the most effective instruction and to close the learning gap most effectively as possible within their 5 years of funding. This provides additional information about the types of programming provided on the chart on the previous slide. In addition, the Supporting English Language Learners website has a complete section on organizing for instruction with suggestions on how to program and plan for EAL learners in elementary, junior middle schools, and senior high schools. This is an example of the green examples page. There are 12 of these pages in total. There's listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So 4 benchmarks with the 3 competencies. There are 12 total pages. Each of them features a row that has the benchmarks competency, so either vocabulary, sentence structure, or transition and connector words, and then below that there is a subject-specific example. When writing these, care was taken to represent English language proficiency across many subjects. So there are examples in mathematics, social studies, English language arts, science, CTF, phys ed and wellness, fine arts, to show that English language proficiency can be assessed across every subject level. These subject-specific examples go across each level so that you can see the progression and distinguish what's beginner, intermediate, or advanced across the proficiency levels. The yellow section has 14 supporting competencies to support teachers with programming and understanding the characteristics of English as an additional language learners. These 14 competencies are representative of strand-specific benchmarks and benchmarks that were updated from Benchmarks 1.0 and the addition of other supporting competencies that will either help teachers understand the characteristics of English language learners and or programming supports that they can put in place. This is an example of the supporting competencies and the additional information that can be quite helpful for teachers when wanting to learn more about characteristics of the learners and or how they can support the learners in inclusive classrooms and at times in those sheltered classes where more specific interventions and language supports are being infused into the curricular understanding. This is an example of the blue section of the benchmarks. There are pages about vocabulary, sentence structure, and connector and transition words. These pages show additional information about the scope and sequence and examples of vocabulary, sentence structure, and connector and transition words, again, to support teachers in their identifying the language that they're observing students when they're trying to benchmark them, and to support them in the instruction of English language learners. Here are 2 examples of language proficiency level documentation and comments that could be used for a report card. For example, Hassan has a LP or language proficiency level 4 for listening and reading, and for speaking and writing they're LP 3. Hassan overall is demonstrating a language proficiency level 3 that they are working on. The comment is made by the teacher using the criteria on the benchmarks to identify what the student is able to do with their language in a particular strand. This session was an overview of Benchmarks 2.0. We discussed the orange section, which is the 3 competencies: vocabulary, sentence structure, and connector and transition words, and how you can assess listening, speaking, reading, and writing. The green section were the examples of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. The yellow section is additional supporting competencies to help teachers understand English as additional language learners, as well as the supports that they can provide. The blue section is additional information and examples of vocabulary, sentence structure, and connector and transition words. This concludes the EAL benchmark session. If you have questions regarding Alberta education requirements for the funding manual or the guide to education, or general programming questions, please contact additional languages at gov.ab.ca. If you have questions about EAL programming or need professional learning sessions for your staff, you can feel free to contact me. Thank you for your time and attention, and good luck using the EAL proficiency benchmarks to monitor and assess language proficiency of your English as an additional language learners.